At 10:47 a.m. on February 12, 1945, the interior of the M4A3E8 Sherman tank, known as Viper, was less a machine of war and more a claustrophobic, deafening oven. It stank of burned oil, fear, and recently spent cordite. Inside the turret, 22-year-old Sergeant Frank Kovac, the loader, was fighting a personal war against the clock, deep in the frozen, shattered remnants of the German town of Wiersdorf. Outside, the temperature hovered near freezing, but inside, sweat poured down Kovac's face. He was braced against the recoil stop, his right arm a blur of calculated, unorthodox movement. The 76mm M1 main gun had just fired, and the empty brass shell casing smoking hot and lethal had clattered into the canvas bag. Load APCR. Load APCR. Kovac. Now, shouted the tank commander, Lieutenant Elias Vance, his voice ragged over the throat mic, peering through the shattered periscope glass. He's traversing. We have maybe 3 seconds. Kovac's heart hammered a rhythm against the steel hull faster than the engine's rumble. 3 seconds was generous, possibly a death sentence. The enemy tank, a massive German Panther OSF, was barely 150 yards away, concealed partially by the rubble of a collapsed bakery. The Panther had already knocked out the lead Sherman in their platoon. Kovac was the only thing standing between the crew and a 75mm armor-piercing round traveling at over 3,000 feet per second. The standard loading procedure for the 76mm required a smooth, deliberate 4-step motion. Retrieve the round from the rack, index the projectile correctly, swing it into the breech, and ram it home. Under combat conditions, this took an average crewman 5.5 to 6 seconds. Kovac was doing it in 4.2 seconds. He didn't follow the manual. He couldn't afford to. While other loaders were trained to use the full weight of their bodies and rely on precision, footing Kovac, a former dock worker from Cleveland, with massive forearm strength and a strange habit of practicing movements, in reverse, had developed a technique his instructors had dubbed the backwards grab. He would retrieve the 76mm round, not by pulling it out fully, but by hooking the base with his thumb and 3 fingers, pulling it slightly back before shoving it forward and twisting the projectile into alignment simultaneously. It looked messy. It looked dangerous, as if he might drop the 14-pound shell, but it shaved almost 1.5 seconds off the time. During training at Fort Knox, he had been routinely reprimanded for it. Kovac, this isn't a factory line. You're sacrificing safety for speed, bellowed his drill sergeant. Kovac always argued back, Sir, safety is being faster than the other guy. His crewmates, initially horrified, had stopped mocking him after the brutal fighting in Normandy, where Kovac's impossible loading speed had saved the Viper. Crew on 3 separate occasions, often giving their gunner Corporal Harris the 1-second margin needed to fire first. Ready! Kovac roared, slamming the breech block shut. The mechanism snapped home with a heavy, metallic finality. He stepped back just as Harris adjusted the elevation dial. Lieutenant Vance didn't wait for the formal confirmation. Fire! Fire! The Sherman lurched back, the muzzle flash momentarily blinding. The sound wave inside the turret was physically violent. For a terrifying half-second, they could only hear a high-pitched ringing. Then the confirmation they needed, a heavy, resonant clang followed by the distinctive, sickening sound of tearing metal, and a secondary explosion 150 yards away. A Panther was hit. Black smoke immediately boiled out of its engine compartment. Traverse left. Target acquisition. We have 2 more incoming from the railway embankment. 300 yards. I count 1 Jagdpanzer IV and another Panther. Vance shouted, ignoring the ringing in his own ears. He knew that taking out the first tank had cost them valuable time. The Germans were recovering quickly. Kovac, without waiting for the lieutenant to finish his threat assessment, was already moving. His muscles burned, driven by pure instinct and the cold realization that the Viper was now positioned directly in the kill zone. He reached for the ammo rack, his eyes fixed on the remaining APCR rounds, the crucial high-penetration ammunition needed to deal with the heavily armored Panthers. He had just destroyed one tank. He needed to destroy 2 more, maybe 3, in the next 90 seconds. If his unorthodox, mocked loading method failed him now, he would be paying the price, not in a reprimand from a drill sergeant, but with the lives of his crew. The pressure mounted. The turret shuddered violently as a high-explosive round from the Jagdpanzer impacted harmlessly into the earth 10 yards to the right. The crew tasted pulverized dirt and concrete. The countdown for the next round began immediately. Kovac grasped the second shell. He had to be faster than 4.2 seconds this time. He had to be perfect. This was the nature of the Viper crew, an assemblage of rejects and nonconformists led by a genius loader who fought the enemy by breaking every rule in the U.S. Army Ordnance Manual. They were not supposed to be here, leading the thrust into Weersdorf. But they were the fastest crew the 3rd Armored Division had left, and speed was the only currency accepted on this stretch of the Western Front. Kovac was a blur of calculated risk. His elbow knocked against the fire extinguisher casing, a pain he barely registered. He executed the backwards grab flawlessly, the APCR round sliding from the rack. Instead of the typical 5-second precision, he relied on muscle memory and sheer force. His speed was terrifying. He bypassed the alignment check, trusting the heavy projectile to seat itself correctly on impact. 4.0 seconds. Loaded. Corporal Harris, the gunner, didn't even need the confirmation. His eye was already pressed against the sight. The Jagdpanzer IV tank destroyer, a low-slung, deadly threat, was traversing its limited field of fire, focusing its long 7.5 centimeters cannon on the Viper. It was 300 yards away, attempting to gain a better firing angle from behind a stack of splintered railway sleepers. Fire! Fire! The gun exploded a second time, the muzzle breaking fiercely against the recoil. The impact was instantaneous. The APCR round struck the center mass of the Jagdpanzer's glacis plate. Though the German tank destroyer was well armored, the high velocity of the 76mm APCR, armor-piercing, composite rigid round, fired at point-blank range for a tank engagement, proved too much. The resulting eruption of smoke and internal fragmentation signaled the end of the threat. 2 down. Shit, that was fast, Kovac, Vance muttered, his adrenaline spiking, momentarily forgetting the Panther still maneuvering in the ruins. We have 1 more. Panther is attempting to flank right, moving 20 kilometers per hour. Get me a high-explosive no. Wait, keep loading a PCR. We need to disable his track now. Kovac reached for the 3rd shell. The strain of the combat loading cycle was already taking its toll. His breath hitched, and his forearms felt like concrete. It was the moment of weakness where the military manual demanded discipline and slowing down. But discipline was something Kovac and the entire 2nd Platoon of Company C had very little patience for. They were known informally throughout the 3rd Armored Division as the scrap heap. The unit hadn't been formed by design, but by necessity and an acute shortage of men who could reliably handle the increasingly complex logistics of tank warfare. It consisted mostly of men who had consistently failed to conform to the rigid discipline expected of the U.S. Army in 1944. Tank drivers who preferred to hotwire jeeps for pleasure, gunners who argued with officers about ballistics tables, and loaders like Frank Kovac who constantly modified their equipment or procedures for marginal gains in speed. They were misfits, enforcers, and encrencuros, disciplined only by the threat of death. Lieutenant Elias Vance, a pragmatic Bostonian who'd been busted down from captain for insubordination in North Africa, had been given command of the scrap heap, specifically because the brass thought the 2 sides deserved each other. Vance's philosophy was simple, and it was why Kovac survived. The manual is written by men who weren't there. If your shortcut works and you're still alive, then it's the right way. Kovac's backwards grab loading method was the prime example of this philosophy. During a 6-week replacement training rotation in England, before D-Day, Kovac had been observed practicing his reverse motion loading. The official procedure required the loader to stand slightly back, grab the base of the round, pull it to the chest for alignment, and then, using both arms, ram it into the breech. Kovac eliminated the pull to the chest phase entirely. He stood closer, used his thumb and fingers as a pivot point, and transferred the upward energy of the grab directly into the horizontal push, using his massive torso as a stabilizing counterweight. The risk was that if his grip failed, the heavy round could crush his fingers or be dropped entirely, rendering the gun useless. But the speed was undeniable. In simulations, Kovac could sustain 4.2 seconds per round for 10 consecutive shots, while the average top-tier loader struggled to stay below 6 seconds. When Vance was assigned the platoon, he saw the reports and disregarded the disciplinary warnings. Kovac, Vance had said during their first meeting, watching the loader run drills, "You look like a monkey trying to crack open a coconut with a wrench. But if that monkey can fire 10 rounds before the Krauts fire 6, I don't care if you load it with your feet." That was the ethos of the scrap heap. They survived not through perfect doctrine, but through survival engineering, improvising, stealing, and modifying until their equipment did what was needed, even if it defied regulation. Their tanks were often wired with stolen German radios for better communication, fitted with extra welded-on tracks for ad hoc armor, and crucially, manned by a crew that operated on a 1.5-second advantage earned by one man's dangerous shortcut. Now, as the Viper lurched violently into a flanking maneuver to avoid the heavy return fire from the still unhit Panther, Kovac's training paid off. He had the third APCR round in his grasp. The Panther was 250 yards away and closing. It fired, and the sound of the shell passing mere feet above the turret was like a colossal, tearing sheet of steel. Kovac slammed the breech shut. 3.9 seconds. A new personal best in the heat of combat. "Ready?" Kovac screamed, his throat raw. Harris didn't hesitate. They were committed now. They had to take the gamble. The target was the Panther's track linkage, a notoriously difficult target to hit on a moving tank. If they missed, the Panther would surely get off a clean shot before Kovac could load a fourth shell. This was the 1-second margin in action. The third shot tore through the air. Harris had aimed slightly low and forward, calculating the Panther's speed and their own tank's jerky movement over the rubble. It was a Hail Mary shot, relying on the high-velocity APCR round to do devastating damage even if it grazed the target. Instead of hitting the track hub directly, the round struck the road wheel and sprocket linkage right above the front drive sprocket. The result was catastrophic. The wheel was disintegrated, the linkage snapped, and the track immediately seized, ripping metal from the hull. The 45-ton Panther slewed violently to the right, its heavy armor now uselessly facing a ruined wall. "Got him! He's crippled!" Vance shouted, relief momentarily replacing the panic. "Kovac, load another APCR. We finish him, then we bug out. The area is too hot." Kovac was already grabbing the fourth round, his mind numb to the physical exhaustion. His focus was tunnel vision, the 4 steps compressed into 3. Retrieve, push, seat, close. His backwards grab had been developed for sustained fire, and this continuous rapid-fire pace was precisely what it was designed for. Fire, 4.1 seconds, loaded. Harris, savoring the victory of immobility, took careful aim at the vulnerable side armor of the stationary Panther, directly above the transmission housing. Fire! The fourth round hit with surgical precision. Unlike the external impacts of the first 3 shots, this one was followed by a sound that vibrated deep into the Sherman. Hull, the muffled whoop of an internal explosion as the round penetrated the thinner side armor and detonated inside the fighting compartment. A torrent of white-hot flame immediately poured out of the Panther's turret ring and driver's visor. 4 enemy vehicles disabled or destroyed in less than 90 seconds. "Frank, you are a goddamned marvel," Vance said, allowing himself a sharp, short laugh. "Driver, reverse hard, full power. Back to the rally point now. We don't stick around for reinforcements." As the Viper roared backward through the ruins, kicking up snow and debris, the initial rush of victory began to fade, replaced by the grim reality of exhaustion and the knowledge of what they had just escaped. It was 10:49 a.m. Kovac slumped back against the radio gear, breathing heavily. He realized his right thumb was throbbing, a deep, persistent ache. During the third rushed loading cycle, the recoil from the previous shot must have caused the lip of the heavy round to catch the edge of his thumb before he slammed it home. He pulled off his glove. The thumb was already swelling alarmingly and purple beneath the nail. It was a small price for 4 destroyed targets, but it meant his grip was compromised. "Status check," Vance called out, a formality returning as they disengaged from immediate combat. "Gunner okay. Driver okay. Bow gunner okay. Loader damaged thumb, sir. Usable, but slow." Vance swiveled his head, concern replacing adrenaline. "How slow?" "Maybe 6 seconds, sir." "Standard procedure only for a while." Kovac tested his grip. The sharp, agonizing pain shot up his wrist. He couldn't risk dropping around at critical speed. His 1-second margin was gone. Vance nodded grimly. The psychological effect was immediate. The fastest loader in the 3rd Armored Division was now just average. They reversed for 500 yards, reaching the dubious safety of a collapsed rail yard where the rest of the 2nd platoon was waiting, hidden among the wrecked trains. Out of the 10 Shermans that had started the push into Wiersdorf, only 5 remained operational. Staff Sergeant Miller, commanding another Sherman, pulled alongside the Viper. He leaped out, his face caked with grime. What the hell happened back there? "We heard the constant barrage. Thought you guys were vaporized." 4 tanks, you say? "That's insane, even for you freaks." "Kovac happened," Vance replied, tapping the loader's damaged thumb. "But he's benched on speed for now." Miller looked at Kovac with a mixture of respect and pity. "You load like a machine, Frank. Nobody ever saw anything like it. But now we have a bigger problem than your thumb. Intelligence says there's a company of grenadiers dug in 400 yards north of here, behind the old gasworks. They have 2 Pak-40s hidden in the rubble. They know we're here now. If we try to push forward, they'll chew us up." The dilemma was stark and immediate. 5 Shermans versus 2 concealed 75mm anti-tank cannons supported by infantry, 400 yards away. Standard procedure called for an infantry-supported flanking maneuver, but their accompanying infantry had been pinned down 2 miles back. They were on their own. Vance looked at the terrain-heavy rubble, narrow visibility, perfect ambush country. A conventional push would result in 2 or 3 more destroyed Shermans before they neutralized the Pak-40s. They needed an angle, a radical tactical improvisation that the manual would never condone. "Vance!" He looked at Kovac, who was nursing his thumb, then around at the abandoned rail yard. The scrap heap had to live up to its name. They had to modify the battle itself. Vance reached for his field glasses, studying the ruins of the gasworks. He saw a solution forming in the chaos, a solution based on scrap noise and sheer brute force which depended entirely on the one component of the Sherman that the Germans least expected them to use effectively, the M4A3's powerful Ford V8 engine. He knew what he had to ask his crew to do. It was suicidal, reckless, and entirely against regulations. But it was the only way to save the rest of the platoon. He looked back at Miller. "Miller," Vance commanded, "hit me 3 of your best mechanics, and bring every spare exhaust pipe we have. We're going to make some noise." The time was 11:15 a.m., the relative quiet of the rail yard, broken only by the distant echo of German mortar fire, was shattered by the urgent clanging of wrenches and the furious activity of the mechanics. Lieutenant Vance's improvised plan was taking shape, driven by desperation and a deep understanding of the Sherman's engineering limitations and strengths. The Sherman M4A3, specifically the late model E8 used by Viper, was powered by a massive 4GA V8 engine, a highly efficient aluminum block that produced 500 horsepower. It was powerful, reliable, and notoriously quiet compared to the diesel engines of some other variants. Vance saw this quiet efficiency not as a benefit, but as a tactical liability in urban combat where surprise was everything. The German grenadiers and PaK-40 crews depended entirely on hearing the tanks approach before firing. Vance's plan was to negate that reliance. "Sergeant Hayes, I need 4 tanks. I want the exhaust baffles ripped out entirely. Every single one. If they have a muffler left, I'll personally put a hole in the tank with my 45. We are turning these Shermans into sonic weapons," Vance ordered, standing beside the engine compartment of Viper. Hayes, a greasy, perpetually unimpressed mechanic from the scrap heap, stared at the lieutenant. "Sir, with all due respect, that'll blow the pistons out and burn the valves after 10 minutes of high revving. We'll lose all back pressure. We only need 3 minutes, Sergeant. 3 minutes of sheer, unholy racket. And you won't lose back pressure if you angle those remaining pipes down and back. Focus the exhaust. We are not just removing the mufflers. We are fabricating a tactical noise assault," Vance explained, drawing a rough diagram in the dirt with a stick. "We need to create the sound of 100 tanks moving, concentrated into 4. Use the spare pipes to extend the existing stack and aim the blast. Think loud, Hayes. Think frightening." This was survival engineering at its crudest and most effective. They were destroying their engines for a temporary tactical advantage. The mechanics went to work with angle grinders and hacksaws, ignoring the manuals that explicitly warned against modifying the exhaust system. They quickly ripped out the internal mufflers, leaving gaping, open stacks. Then, using salvaged piping from destroyed German trucks and train couplings, improvising connections with welding torches and heavy clamps, they extended the stacks backward and slightly downward on the 4 chosen Shermans, including Viper. The goal was dual purpose. Maximize the engine roar, creating a sound profile so loud and distorted that it was impossible to discern the number of tanks involved or their precise location, and direct the intense heat and sound directly at the ground behind them, which would amplify the reverberation through the rubble. At 11:45 a.m., 30 minutes after the engagement, the 4 modified Shermans were ready. They lined up in a tight wedge formation, engines idling menacingly. Even at low revolutions, the change was dramatic. The deep, heavy thrum of the Ford V8 was replaced by a sharp, snarling bellow. Vance checked his watch. He had to assume the Germans were now ready and waiting, perhaps even calling in artillery. "Kovac, how's the thumb?" Vance asked, tapping the loader's shoulder. Kovac gave a thumbs up, the good one. 6 seconds, steady, Lieutenant. But I have an idea for the main offensive. Since we're going to be slow, we have to maximize what hits. Vance leaned in, listening intently. Kovac proposed substituting their standard ammunition loadout for the attack run. Typically, they carried a mix of a PCR, standard armor piercing, APC, and high explosive, HE. "Sir, the PaK-40s are hidden behind weak walls. We don't need penetration for their camouflage. We need area effect and blast radius," Kovac argued. "If we hit them, we need to guarantee they don't fire a second time. I want to load almost exclusively high explosive. We save the APCR for any unexpected armored counterattack." It was a risky move. HE rounds were notoriously ineffective against direct frontal armor, but Kovac was right. If they could get close enough, the massive blast radius of the HE would eliminate the anti-tank gun and its crew, even if the shell struck near, not on, the position. It was a strategy for breaching fortifications, not direct tank combat. Vance considered the terrain and the enemy's reliance on cover. "All right, Kovac, scrape the racks. We load 80% high explosive. We hit them hard and loud, or we don't hit them at all." The plan was now finalized. A sonic and tactical assault designed to overload the enemy's senses and neutralize their hidden positions with overwhelming concussion. At 11:55 a.m., Vance gave the command. Engines to full power. Drivers, hold formation. We are advancing 400 yards at 30 kilometers per hour. Gunner, you fire on anything that moves. And Frank, make sure that first T round is in the breech before we hit the rubble. The 4 Shermans surged forward. The rail yard exploded in noise. The open exhausts of the 4 M4A3E8S merged into a single, monstrous, tearing roar, a sound so violent it seemed to rip the very fabric of the air. It was not the sound of 4 tanks. It was the sound of an entire, unstoppable armored column descending on the gasworks. The symphony of terror had begun. If you want to see how this decision changed the battle and whether the scrap heap survived their sonic gambit, smash that like button right now. It helps YouTube push these forgotten stories to people who've never heard them. Make sure you're subscribed, because the next story might change how you see the entire war. Back to Lieutenant Vance and Sergeant Kovac. The roar was physical. Inside the Viper, the crew felt the deep, bone-vibrating resonance of the 4 open-piped Ford V8 South. It was deafening, painful, and beautiful. The sound traveled ahead of the tanks like a shockwave, reflecting off the shattered masonry of Wiersdorf. Outside, the German grenadiers and the 2 Pak 40 crews dug in near the gasworks were instantly plunged into chaos. The sheer volume and distortion of the noise made precise targeting impossible. They could hear tanks, but the sound was too enveloping to pinpoint the number or direction. It sounded like an armored wave, not a 4-vehicle patrol. At 11:57 a.m., the 4 Shermans crossed the 300-yard mark. They were moving quickly, traversing the treacherous rubble field faster than any manual recommended, trusting the wider tracks of the E8 models and the raw power of the engine to absorb the shocks. Kovac, nursing his swollen thumb, fought through the pain to load the first high-explosive He round. The He shells were lighter than the APCR, but their sheer length made the backwards grab technique impossible. He had to rely on the standard, slower, 6-second method, meticulously guiding the round home. First Pak 40 position, far right, behind the water tower foundation, 150 yards. Vance yelled, citing the subtle break in the rubble that confirmed the German position. The Pak 40 crew was desperately trying to line up a shot through the narrow firing slit, but the cacophony was destroying their concentration. The earth shook so violently that their rudimentary aiming system was bouncing. "Ready," Kovac announced, sealing the breach. 6 seconds felt like an eternity. Harris, the gunner, didn't need the usual verbal permission from Vance. The situation was too fluid. He sighted the base of the water tower and fired. The He round struck a retaining wall just to the left of the Pak 40 position. The 76 millimeters He shell detonated with tremendous violence. Shrapnel, concrete dust, and the concussion wave obliterated the firing slit and collapsed a section of the wall onto the gun position. The effect was immediate. The Pak 40 was silent, its crew either dead, stunned, or buried. 2 down, 1 to go. The 4 Shermans maintained their terrifying forward momentum, covering another 50 yards in seconds. They were now only 100 yards from the core German positions, directly in the small kill zone that the 2nd Pak 40 was designed to cover. The 2nd anti-tank crew, positioned near the entrance of the main gas silo, managed to regain their composure despite the overwhelming noise. They had visual confirmation. 4 Shermans, not an entire company. They swung their cannon, tracking the lead tank, the Viper. At 11:58 a.m., the second pack 40 fired. The shell streaked low and fast, impacting the front of the Sherman, just behind the driver's viewing port. The sound of the impact was like a giant hammer blow against an iron bell. Inside the Viper, the tank seemed to stop breathing. The armor held, but the force of the impact was tremendous, throwing the crew forward. The driver, Private Jenkins, slumped over the controls, momentarily stunned, and the tank veered sharply right, narrowly missing a massive pile of concrete rubble. "Driver! Status!" "Jenkins!" Vance roared, his head ringing. "Concussed, sir. On it." Jenkins managed, shaking his head violently and wrestling the controls back to center. The German Pack 40 crew, seeing the Sherman stagger but not stop, prepared to reload. They had only a few seconds. "Kovac, load, load." "We're sitting ducks." Kovac's injured thumb was screaming. He fumbled slightly with the heavy he round, losing a precious half-second. He couldn't sustain the 6-second standard. He was slowing down under the pressure and the physical shock of the hit. The psychological wall was closing in. Retrieve, align, ram. The breech snapped shut at 7.1 seconds. Slow, agonizingly slow. Ready. The German Pack 40 fired again. This time, the angle was too acute. The round whizzed past the Viper's turret, striking the lead Sherman in the wedge formation, Staff Sergeant Miller's tank, on the side of the track assembly. The track was thrown clear, and Miller's Sherman stopped dead, listing sharply, but still fighting. Harris, the gunner, adjusted his sight. The second Pack 40 position was now directly in his crosshairs. He didn't aim at the gun, but at the massive, unstable gas silo directly behind it, betting on the unstable structure to finish the job. Fire! The fourth He round of the attack struck the base of the rusted iron silo. The concussion was enormous. The compromised metal structure, weakened by previous bombing, groaned, then gave way. The entire silo, 50 feet tall and filled with years of gaseous residue, began to collapse. It didn't explode in a massive fireball, but rather imploded, crushing the second Pack 40 position and the supporting grenadiers beneath tons of twisted metal, brick, and dust. Silence, relative to the preceding 5 minutes, fell over the battlefield. Vance watched the dust cloud rise, breathing deeply. The immediate threat was gone. 4 tanks destroyed, disabled by Kovac in the first minute, and 2 anti-tank positions neutralized by the improvised sonic attack and high-explosive strategy. "Platoon, this is Viper. We neutralize the remaining infantry, and then we hold." "Miller, are you mobile?" Miller's voice crackled over the radio, filled with admiration. "Negative, Viper. Tracked. But we are alive. And Lieutenant... What the hell was that noise? It sounded like the Devil's Opera." "That, Sergeant Miller, was the sound of 4 Ford V8's ace, breaking every rule in the book," Vance replied, looking back at Kovac. The cost, however, was imminent. Kovac's thumb was now unusable, throbbing violently, and the engines of the 4 tanks were already overheating dangerously. They had paid for the tactical victory with a massive expenditure of speed, stealth, and mechanical integrity. They had punched a hole, but they had to hold it with compromised equipment, facing an enemy that would soon be sending the true counterattack. They were deep in enemy territory, and now they were loud, slow, and exposed. It was 12:10 p.m. The 4 operational Shermans positioned themselves defensively among the ruins of the gasworks. The 4 open exhausts hissed and popped, the extreme heat of the running V8 engines radiating from the stacks. The noise was still overwhelming, a low, menacing snarl even at idle. Vance knew they were on borrowed time. The sonic assault had bought them 15 minutes of confusion, but the sheer noise would soon attract every German unit within a mile radius. They needed to secure the ground, evacuate Miller's crew if possible, and silence the tanks before they destroyed their own engines. Kovac was trying to immobilize his thumb. The pain was blinding, making the simple act of retrieving a canteen difficult. If he had to load again, he was limited to using his left hand for stability and the palm of his right hand to push the heavy round. He was looking at 9 or 10 seconds per round, effectively useless against coordinated German armor. Sergeant Kovac, we need those engines quieted down. Can you and Hayes fix those exhausts enough to regain some back pressure without spending an hour on proper reassembly? Vance asked, still scanning the horizon for the inevitable counterattack. Kovac shook his head. No time, sir. And we don't have the proper baffles. But we can choke the sound enough to mask us, even if we can't fix the performance. He called for Sergeant Hayes, the mechanic. Hayes, we need mud, sandbags, and any water you can spare. This was the next layer of scrap heap survival engineering. Since they couldn't fix the pipes properly, they would improvise a silencer. They couldn't weld a new baffle into the open stacks, but they could create a temporary choke point to dampen the noise just enough to talk and reduce the acoustic signature. Hayes quickly gathered 4 empty canvas bags and the only available material: the wet, frozen dirt and sludge from the collapsed gas silo foundations. Kovac directed the process. They packed the wet mud and dirt tightly into the canvas bags, creating heavy, dense plugs. Working quickly, despite the searing heat coming off the engine decks, they hammered these improvised mud sandbags directly into the end of the 4 open exhaust pipes, securing them with thick layers of scrap wire and heavy clamps. The moment they fired up the engines again, the difference was immediately apparent. The bone-jarring roar dropped to a deep, muffled rumble. It was still loud enough to be heard within 100 yards, but the terrifying, directionless acoustic signature that had paralyzed the PaK-40 crews was gone. The tanks sounded merely like tanks again, not a freight train coming off the rails. That all lost maybe 10 minutes before the heat dries the mud and blows the bags out, sir, Hayes warned, wiping his blackened face. 10 minutes is all we have, Vance acknowledged. 12:15 p.m. The silence of the tanks revealed new, terrifying sounds. The distant whine of heavy engines, German engines moving quickly toward their position. The counterattack was coming from the north and west. Incoming armor, Sergeant. Sound profile indicates at least 2 vehicles, heavy. Could be Tigers or more Panthers, Vance stated, his voice tight. They are definitely investigating the silence and the smoke from the silo. They were facing a major dilemma. They were exposed, stationary, and their fastest loader was injured. They had exactly 4 operational Shermans, and the enemy was sending heavy armor specifically to wipe out the penetration force. Vance looked at Kovac. Frank, you are confined to light duty. You can't load heavy rounds. We need speed more than anything right now. We need the 1-second margin. Sir, I can't. My right hand is useless for gripping the base of the round, Kovac insisted, clutching his throbbing thumb. Vance suddenly noticed the discarded wreckage of the first Panther they had destroyed. An idea, reckless and bordering on insane, formed in his mind. Forget the manual entirely, Frank. We're fighting a losing game if we follow the rules. We don't have time for 6-second loads. We need to cheat. We need the speed, not the grip. Vance pulled out his M3 grease gun submachine gun and gestured toward the ammo rack. We're not going to use your thumb to grip the round, Frank. We're going to use a tool. He instructed the gunner, Harris, to remove the internal metal brackets from the main storage rack. They quickly scavenged 2 heavy-duty leather belts from the dead German crew of the nearby Jag Panzer, which were stronger and wider than their standard issue belts. The plan was a grotesque form of mechanical augmentation. They created a simple, improvised harness. Kovac strapped his injured right hand and forearm to a length of thick salvage steel piping, effectively turning his entire arm into a stiff, rigid ramming rod. The leather belts secured the pipe firmly. The final piece of improvisation was the loading tool itself. Vance took the steel piping and carefully welded a small, heavy piece of shaped steel onto the end, a cradle designed to fit the base of a 76 millimeters round perfectly. Kovac's arm was no longer a human limb capable of precision gripping. It was a 15-pound mechanical piston designed solely for speed and force. He wouldn't need to grip the shell. He would use the leverage of his entire torso to push the round directly from the rack and ram it into the breech with a single brutal movement. It was 12:25 p.m. The German tanks were closing within 400 yards. They could hear the heavy rumble clearly now. Kovac tested the rig. The pain in his thumb was dulled by the rigidity of the strapping, replaced by the sheer difficulty of maneuvering the heavy, augmented arm. "Can you do it, Frank?" Vance asked, his voice low. Kovac, looking utterly exhausted and covered in grime, gave a stiff nod. "Sir, I can't stop. I can only push." The German counterattack had found its target. Two massive Tiger 2A USFB tanks, the dreaded Königsdegger, King Tiger, slowly emerged from the smoke, 350 yards away. They were too heavily armored for the Sherman's 76 millimeters gun to reliably penetrate from the front. Vance knew the score. They were dead unless they managed to hit the weak spots, the tracks, the turret ring, or the rear armor. And to do that, they had to fire first, fire accurately, and fire faster than the Tigers expected. They needed every fraction of a second they could steal. Gunner, a PCR Kovac, put the first round in the breech. "We are initiating engagement at 300 yards. We fire and we move. The scrap heap is back in business." The King Tigers were the apex predators of the battlefield. Their frontal armor was nearly impenetrable by the 76 millimeters main gun of the Sherman, especially at the range of 350 yards. The only viable targets were the thin side armor, if they could force a traverse, the muzzle brake, or a lucky shot to the drive sprocket. They were armed with the lethal 8.8 centimeters KWK 43L71 cannon, capable of neutralizing a Sherman at over 2,000 yards. The odds were 2-4, but the disparity in firepower made it feel like 20-4. Vance watched the lead King Tiger through his periscope. It was advancing slowly, confidently, its long gun elevated slightly, scanning the ruins. The German crew knew they held all the cards. "Platoon, this is Viper. Focus fire on the lead Tiger. We aim for the tracks. We have to disable them before they get within 250 yards. Drivers, prepare for a maximum speed lateral run on my command. We move or we die." Inside the Viper, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Kovac, his right arm rigid and heavy, adjusted the stance of his piston loader rig. He selected the first APCR round, its density and shape crucial for maximizing the chance of track penetration. He did not attempt to grip the round. He used the flat cradle end of the metal pipe welded to his forearm, aligning it roughly with the base of the shell. With a grunt, he used his shoulder and back muscles, generating a surprising amount of force, leveraging the round out of the rack and ramming it toward the breech. The movement was crude, brutal, and terrifyingly fast. The metal cradle connected with the breech block with a loud clang. Kovac pulled back his augmented arm and slammed the block shut. 3.8 seconds. He had just broken his personal best time, achieving the impossible by sacrificing his human precision for raw mechanical speed. The loss of his thumb had forced an engineering solution that was faster than his natural, but damaged, technique. "Ready?" Kovac yelled. 12:28 p.m. The King Tiger was 300 yards away. "Fire!" 4 Shermans fired simultaneously. 4 high-velocity APCR rounds streaked toward the massive German tank. "Fire!" The effect was disappointing. 3 rounds ricocheted harmlessly off the thick frontal glacis. Only the Viper's shot, fired by Harris, struck the intended target, the extreme front of the track, just where the heavy tread links met the ground. It didn't fully penetrate, but the force was enough to momentarily jar the track, causing the Tiger to momentarily stutter. The Tiger, now certain of the Sherman's location, responded instantly. A flash, a roar, and the distinct sound of the 88mm shell ripping through the air. It struck the Sherman closest to Vance, Cobra, on the upper side of the hull. The explosion was horrific. The heavy 88mm round passed through the thin side armor, exploding the ammunition rack immediately. The turret was blown completely free of the hull, and the tank erupted in an uncontrollable pyrotechnic inferno. 3 operational Shermans remained. Lateral run, go. Move left, fire a PCR. At the tracks. Kovac, you know what to do? Faster. Vance screamed, fighting the instinct to stare at the burning wreckage of Cobra. The 3 remaining Shermans lurched into a full-speed evasive maneuver, engines roaring loudly against the dampening effect of the mud packs. Kovac was already ramming the second APCR round. Pain was irrelevant. His arm felt like a disconnected instrument. He focused purely on the leverage and the angle. Ready. 3.6 seconds. Ready. Fire. The 3 Shermans fired again, still focusing on the tracks of the lead King Tiger. 2 rounds bounced off the thick side skirt armor as the Tiger shifted position. But the 3rd round, from an adjacent Sherman, struck the lower plate of the drive sprocket cover. It didn't destroy it, but it seized the mechanism with a sickening grind of torn steel. The lead King Tiger was stopped, crippled 250 yards away, but its massive cannon was still fully operational. Target the gunner's optic. Harris, hit the slit, Vance ordered. It was a shot of almost impossible precision, but the only way to blind the Tiger while its mate closed in. Kovac retrieved the 3rd shell. The sheer effort was beginning to shake his entire body. He tasted bile. The German Tiger was traversing its turret, lining up a clean, killing blow on the Viper. 3.9 seconds. The piston loader technique was starting to fatigue. Harris fired. The shot was close, impacting the mantle, but failing to disable the optics. Now, the second King Tiger, which had been traversing wide to find a flanking position, was 300 yards away and coming fast. It hadn't fired yet, waiting for the perfect moment. Kovac, 4th round, APCR. We are breaking formation. Drivers, scatter. Take cover behind the gas silo. Vance commanded, knowing a second 88mm hit would be the end. Kovac realized the true danger. He had destroyed 4 tanks in the first engagement, but the price of that victory, his speed, was now the only thing keeping them alive against the 2 King Tigers. His piston loader arm was trembling. He had to be perfect one last time before they scattered. 4.0 seconds. The 4th round was seated. Ready. But before Harris could fire, the first King Tiger, still stationary, got off a perfect shot at the retreating Viper. The 88mm shell struck the front transmission housing with an apocalyptic force. 12:30 p.m. The impact of the 88mm shell was devastating. Even though the heavy front armor absorbed the penetration, the massive kinetic energy transfer ripped through the transmission housing and gearbox. The Viper lurched to a catastrophic halt, smoke and oil instantly pouring into the fighting compartment. The driver, Jenkins, screamed. Shrapnel from the gearbox explosion sprayed the crew compartment. Vance felt a sharp, searing pain in his left leg. "Bail out! Bail out! We're burning!" Vance roared, pushing open the main turret hatch, the release handle hot beneath his gloved hand. The air immediately flooded with the metallic, acrid smell of burning wiring and hot oil. Kovac was halfway to the radio operator's hatch, his piston loader arm an unwieldy burden, when he realized the gunner, Harris, was slumped over his sight, unconscious. "Harris is down. He's hit." Kovac screamed over the ringing in his ears. Vance, dragging his injured leg, dropped back into the turret just as the second King Tiger began traversing its deadly cannon toward their now immobile target. They had maybe 10 seconds before the second 88mm round would vaporize the Viper. They were facing the ultimate dilemma: survival or rescue. The German infantry and tanks would converge on the burning Sherman quickly. "Frank, you have to go. Now. I'll try to get Harris out," Vance commanded, forcing Kovac toward the small radio operator's hatch. But Kovac, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate loyalty forged in the cramped hell of the turret, saw a different, impossible option. The Viper was dead, but its gun was still loaded with the fourth APCR round. "No, sir, one more shot," Kovac shouted. Vance stared at him in disbelief. "The tank is immobile, Frank. We are dead." "Get out." Kovac ignored the lieutenant. He shoved his unwieldy piston loader arm into the firing mechanism, leveraging the heavy cradle against the trigger guard. He pressed the firing lever with his left hand while simultaneously kicking the gunner's foot off the pedal. The fourth round fired. The violent recoil shook the crippled Sherman one last time. Kovac had aimed not with the sight, but with the rough alignment of the fixed barrel, aiming for the second King Tiger, which was still 300 yards away and rapidly closing. The shot was wild, missing the Tiger completely, but it struck the ground directly in front of the massive tank's tracks. The APCR round, designed for penetration, fragmented violently on impact with the frozen ground, kicking up an enormous, blinding curtain of earth, smoke, and ice shards directly into the Tiger's line of sight. It was a desperation move, a smokescreen created by an armor-piercing shell. "That's it. Get out," Vance yelled, grabbing Kovac's harness and pulling him toward the open-top hatch. Kovac, Vance, and the bow gunner scrambled out of the burning turret. They quickly dragged the unconscious Harris through the smoky hatchway, dropping onto the engine deck of the crippled Sherman. 12:32 p.m. The battlefield was chaos. The two remaining operational Shermans, Stinger and Rattler, were attempting to lay down suppressing fire against the approaching infantry and the second, now blinded, King Tiger. Vance, despite his injured leg, helped drag Harris off the engine deck. They used the massive, stationary bulk of the burning King Tiger, the one Kovac had immobilized earlier, as immediate cover 250 yards away. "Hayes, Miller's crew, get over here. We have to move Harris," Vance shouted into his field radio. The heat from the burning Viper was intense, and the smoke was thick. They had successfully disrupted the counterattack by blinding the second Tiger, but they were now an exposed wounded infantry squad trying to evacuate their casualties. The first King Tiger, crippled but functional, had regained its composure. The smoke cleared slightly, and the tank commander immediately spotted the survivors scrambling behind the wreckage of the Panther. The enormous 88mm gun traversed slowly, deliberately. Vance realized that their survival now depended on their speed on the ground, a speed that was impossible with a wounded man and a commander with a leg injury. Kovac looked at the improvised ramming rig still attached to his arm. It was heavy, rigid, and useless for loading now, but it was a perfect thick piece of welded steel pipe. "Sir, the King Tiger is lining up." "I need a grenade," Kovac demanded. Vance, confused, tossed him a standard M2 fragmentation grenade. Kovac ignored the German tank. He looked at the wreckage of the Panther, the one they had destroyed with the first shot of the day. The large, heavy rear hatch of the Panther was still intact, hinged but closed. "We need a distraction, sir." "A big one," Kovac said. He shoved the safety pin of the fragmentation grenade into the heavy, welded cradle of his piston loader arm. He used the rigid metal pipe to apply crushing pressure against the pin, bending it enough to get a grip with his left hand, and yanked it free. He knew he had only 4 seconds. He didn't throw the grenade. He used the rigidity of the piston loader arm to ram the armed grenade into the track link assembly of the disabled Panther, wedging it tightly between the track and the hull. Kovac and Vance dove for cover behind the remaining portion of the concrete foundation. 12:35 p.m. The grenade detonated. The explosion was small, contained, but perfectly placed to sever the remaining pieces of the Panther's track. The secondary effect was what Kovac was banking on. The detonation caused a small, yet visible rupture in the Panther's already burning fuel tank. A jet of fire, fueled by 200 gallons of German high-octane gasoline, erupted from the Panther's engine deck and soared 30 feet into the air. The intense, sudden fireball provided the perfect fiery distraction, obscuring Vance's survivors, just as the second King Tiger found its mark and fired. The 88mm round passed harmlessly over their heads, striking the ruins of the silo. Kovac's final act of battlefield engineering, the use of his own broken body, and an improvised loading tool to create a tactical smokescreen, had saved their lives, at least for the moment. They had evacuated the tank, but they were still trapped between two operational King Tigers, 400 yards from friendly lines. 12:45 p.m. The fireball from the Panther wreckage provided the critical minutes of cover needed. Under the protection of the thick smoke, the two remaining operational Shermans, Stinger and Rattler, laid down heavy, suppressing fire, keeping the German infantry pinned down. The crews of Viper and the crippled Cobra survivors converged on the massive ruins of the gasworks. Lieutenant Vance, leaning heavily on the bow gunner, assessed their situation. 6 men, including the unconscious Harris, 2 wounded, Vance and Kovac, and the realization that the Germans would soon flank their position. The 2 King Tigers were still threats. The first was crippled but armed, waiting for the smoke to clear. The second was maneuvering blindly through the debris field, its commander confused by the sudden surge of fire and smoke. "We need to get Harris and the rest of the survivors back to the rail yard, and we need to silence those 2 remaining operational Shermans, or the Germans will hunt them down," Vance commanded, his voice strained. Staff Sergeant Miller's tank, the crippled Cobra, was still stationary 100 yards back, its track thrown but its crew safe inside. They had no way to tow the tank back, with only 2 available Shermans under fire. This was the final, desperate improvisation. Kovac, his piston-loader arm still rigidly secured, approached Vance. "Sir, we can't tow Miller's tank, but we can take his main gun." Miller, listening over the radio, immediately understood the implication. His tank was a static target, but its main cannon was fully functional. The plan was audacious. Abandon the hull of Cobra, but utilize its heavy turret as a temporary, independent artillery piece. Miller's crew rapidly began disassembling the complex electrical and hydraulic lines connecting the 76mm turret to the hull. They disconnected the turret traverse motor and the gun stabilizer. Using the small, improvised welding kit they had salvaged from the burned-out Viper, they sealed the connection points. The goal was to turn the 14,000-pound turret into a temporary bunker, capable of firing at least 2 more rounds. Meanwhile, Kovac, with his augmented arm, focused on the ultimate heavy lift, the extraction of the wounded Harris. Kovac had the raw strength, and the rigid steel pipe on his arm served as a perfect lever and splint, allowing him to lift the unconscious gunner without using his damaged grip. At 1:00 p.m., the smoke began to dissipate. The second King Tiger spotted Rattler, laying suppressing fire, and immediately shifted its gun. "Rattler, fall back, now," Vance yelled. The 88mm round struck near Rattler, sending shrapnel whistling. Rattler and Stinger retreated swiftly back toward the rail yard, leaving the main push area silent, except for the heavy, rhythmic thud of the distant German mortar fire. The focus shifted entirely to the immobilized Cobra. Miller's crew finished their rapid field modification. They had essentially disconnected the turret and set it on the hull like a bunker. They now had a limited manual traverse capability, but the gun was ready. "We have 2 APCR rounds left," Miller reported. The rest is he, ready to fire on your command. The German King Tigers, sensing victory, began their final advance, closing the distance to 200 yards. They were moving confidently, assuming the Shermans had retreated completely. Miller, wait until they pass the 100-yard mark. Aim for the turret ring, then abandon the turret. Kovac, get Harris moving. We're heading for the rail line cover. The final confrontation was a desperate ambush. Miller waited until the lead, crippled King Tiger lumbered past the destroyed Panther, confident in its armor. At 90 yards, Miller's turret erupted. The 76mm APCR round, fired at point-blank range, struck the crippled King Tiger directly on the thin armor of the exhaust port at the rear of the engine deck. The German commander had forgotten that he had presented his rear quarter during his earlier traverse. The engine compartment instantly flared, the dense diesel fuel catching fire. The lead King Tiger was neutralized. Miller and his crew bailed out of the turret hatch and sprinted toward the rail yard, leaving their functional but abandoned turret to confuse the remaining German Tiger. The second King Tiger, realizing it was ambushed, stopped and traversed its cannon toward the source of the fire. But Miller's abandoned turret confused the commander. Why would the crew leave a functional gun? This hesitation was all the survivors needed. At 1:15 p.m., under the heavy cover of the rail yard, the remaining crew of the scrap heap consolidated. They had lost 2 tanks, but they had destroyed 6 enemy vehicles and 2 anti-tank guns, neutralizing a formidable counterattack and securing the vital penetration point into Wiersdorf. Sergeant Frank Kovac's piston loader arm, dripping with oil and blood, had delivered the speed needed to survive the initial onslaught and the tactical awareness to ensure their final escape. His sacrifice of discipline for speed, scorned in training, had been the difference between a wiped-out platoon and a critical breakthrough. The scrap heap held the line at Wiersdorf until the main infantry support arrived later that afternoon. Of the 10 Shermans that started the operation, 5 returned to the Maintenance Depot 3 crippled, 2 running, all requiring extensive mechanical overhaul, especially the 4 that had their exhaust systems brutalized. Sergeant Frank Kovac was immediately taken to the field hospital. His thumb was fractured and severely bruised, requiring 3 months of recovery time and surgery. Kovac was later officially cited for bravery and exceptional service. His actual citation noted the destruction of 4 enemy tanks in the initial engagement and credited his unorthodox, high-speed loading procedure for saving the lives of his entire crew, and eventually the breakthrough into Wiersdorf. The military, however, never officially adopted the backwards grab or the piston loader modifications. The risk to the loader's digits was deemed too great for mass deployment. The technique remained confined to the legends of the 3rd Armored Division, passed around by mechanics and tank crews as the insane gambit of Sergeant Frank Kovac. He returned to the front in May 1945, after the fighting in Germany had largely collapsed. He served out the rest of the occupation with Lieutenant Vance and the remaining members of the scrap heap, who never quite managed to shake their reputation for improvisational chaos. Vance, promoted back to captain, often remarked that the best combat engineers weren't the ones who built bridges, but the ones who modified the equipment until it did what the manual said was impossible. Frank Kovac's story is a profound example of World War II survival engineering, the moment when human ingenuity, backed by raw nerve and the courage to break the rules, provided the fraction of a second needed to shift the balance of power. He proved that sometimes safety isn't found in adherence to procedure, but in being absolutely, recklessly faster than the enemy. The 1-second margin he earned wasn't just a measure of speed, it was the measure of his crew's survival. If this story moved you, don't just click away. Hit like, hit subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in World War II. Our community is global, and together we're guarding these memories from being lost. Sergeant Frank Kovac and the rest of the scrap heap paid the price for that 1 second margin in blood, sweat, and fractured bones. All we're asked to do is remember their sacrifices. Never forget.